Good morning. Good morning. I'm sure that we are all in place and looking forward to this important session. Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to each of you joining us for the CBN Media Breakfast at this 6th PIDA week. Wow, I think the most important place to start is the fact that we're also grateful for our existence in the context of what has been such a torrid year or more under the dark shadow of COVID-19, as we see the script for our existence and progress rewritten and debated. And our task here today is to make a credible effort to bring certainty in the climate of change and to demonstrate that however our objectives are designed, they are able to adapt to the changing needs of our time and to deliver the outcomes we are aiming for. So it is our pleasure to welcome you to the Continental Business Network. And as you may already know, it's an African Union Heads of State and Government response to facilitate private sector advice and leadership in this essential work of continent-wide infrastructure project development. One of the key missions is to bridge this infrastructure financing gap in Africa, enhancing the livelihood of Africans. So the one thing that has not changed over the course of this year has been the concept of time itself. It's a resource I'm sure we'll have run out very quickly of during this session. So let's get started immediately. We are going to begin with some opening comments by our speakers, watch an important presentation, and then engage in some conversation and Q&A. My name is Iman Rapeti, and I'm so pleased to have been invited to moderate this event today. And so for those of you who are joining us for the very first time, please feel warmly welcomed and indicate when you have something to share or to ask. So I think without further ado, and the nice thing about our event today is you can read I think what is an important read is to look back at some of the experience records of our speakers, where they hail from, and why their invitation to this moment is so important. So I'm not going to read out their CVs as I introduce them, but just rely on them to really just share with us their point of view and their perspectives. And I want to begin by welcoming His Excellency, Dr. Ibrahim Asane Mayaki, who is also the CEO of AUDA and NEPAD.
Okay. Good morning.
Oh, good morning. Good morning. It's lovely to see you. And I see there's such a beautiful background behind you. It mimics the garden behind me as well.
Well, we have a coherence in beauties of backgrounds then, which is a good start. Thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me. And let me start by reiterating what you said at the beginning. We are holding this meeting within a very particular context, which is marked by the pandemic. And the pandemic has consequences, social consequences, economic consequences, governance consequences, and also what we don't frequently talk about, psychological consequences. So as we aim to enter a new normal, we don't even know what this new normal will be about. So for me, it's very important to open this CBN meeting for two main reasons. The first one is CBN is one of the tools, critical tools, that the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD, has built in order to accelerate the implementation of PIDA. And please remind and remember this concept, which is about acceleration. The second reason is the openness we adopted as an institution of the AU in making sure that this instrument, the Continental Business Network, was not a bureaucratic institution, but was an open institution welcoming other actors, mainly private sector actors, in order to own the process of PIDA's implementation. But let me start by recognizing the presence of Ambassador Birgit Markussen, head of the EU delegation to the African Union, and really appreciate the participation of our very loyal supporters, sponsors, collaborators, colleagues of UNECA, DBSA, and all the private sector representatives. And evidently, welcome the media and all our stakeholders, without whom we wouldn't be able to share the benefits regarding the implementation of PIDA. So I will go quickly through 5 points. My first one will be about history. It's always important to remind ourselves about the historical context which led to PIDA. And the best way to do it is to look at how was Africa's infrastructure managed and implemented before PIDA. Before PIDA, the main obstacle that we faced as an African Union institution was the lack of prioritization in regional projects. Fundamentally, as we all know, PIDA is about regional projects. Before PIDA, there was no prioritization of these regional projects. And critical actors, African Union Commission, African Development Bank, United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, regional economic communities, and the African Union Development Agency, which was at that time called the NEPAD, Planning and Coordinating Agency, we decided that it was incoherent not to have a prioritization of regional projects, because we wouldn't be able to evaluate our progresses in terms of regional integration if we couldn't agree on critical priority regional projects and start implementing them with a sense of division of labor between what the Commission would do, what NEPAD would do, what the regional economic communities would do, and what the African Development Bank, which is a critical actor in this domain, would do. So we needed prioritization in order to foster alignment. And if we could prioritize and align, then we would be able to say, this is the impact that PIDA's implementation has on regional integration. Bearing in mind that the objectives of regional integration are fundamentally about the economic transformation of the continent. So when we talk about PIDA, we should always have in mind these three concepts: prioritization, alignment, and then economic transformation. So PIDA is not about, as some might think, about, building roads, bridges, etc. It is about that, but fundamentally it is not about that. Fundamentally, it is a strategic continental framework where there is a prioritization and an alignment in order to induce economic transformation. And that's why it was built in a bottom-up approach, starting with master plans in infrastructure of all the regional economic communities, and extracting from these master plans priority projects on which we could agree. And that led to what we called PIDA PAP 1, with a process of rationalization of what could be realistically done and what could be thought about in terms of projections in mid and long term. So if you look at this historical process, you understand how far we have gone. But when we did that, by designing PIDA and designing PIDA PAP 1 and constructing this pipeline of projects, we are just halfway. We are halfway of what PIDA could bring in terms of economic transformation. We still had to go through a higher level of project preparation capacity. We still had to go through financing all the different steps that can allow to develop a project and to lead to its financing stage. And as you know, we all realized that we had a big weakness, I repeat, a big weakness, which was a lack of collective project preparation capacity. So we had to tackle this issue of project preparation capacity, because if we didn't tackle this issue, evidently financing wouldn't be feasible. And that's why internally we designed with our partners what we call the service delivery mechanism. After long discussions with UNECA, the African Development Bank, regional economic communities, looking at the 25, 26 project preparation facilities which existed all over the continent with a certain level of disorder and incoherence because governments didn't know to which project preparation facility they should liaise. So we had to put order in that. And that order led to the design of a mechanism, which was a service delivery mechanism. We evidently had for a long time what is called the NEPAD IPPF, which is located at the African Development Bank. But the NEPAD IPPF was more owned by partners than owned by African stakeholders. So we also had to bring clarity into that, so that the objectives of the NEPAD IPPF could coincide with the objective that we had defined within PIDA. So second step, the recognition of a high weakness in terms of project preparation and the correction of that weakness by the design of an instrument, which could then allow us to think more realistically about the financing of the projects. And it's interesting, but we hold this breakfast at a moment where financing issues are being somehow tainted by levels of uncertainty. Why? Because of the reduction of our fiscal space in all African countries, and because of a financial constraint that you see everywhere. So evidently, there is a consequence that we need to not only apprehend, but understand, so that the concept of acceleration I was talking about at the beginning can be rightly reflected. So beyond the issue of project preparation capacity, which could lead to financing, we realized that the financing gap of PIDA was huge. But when I say huge, it has to be based on an hypothesis. And our hypothesis was to make Africa grow economically at least a growth rate, economic growth rate of 6%. So in order to induce that growth, we needed to tackle the issue of financing gap in terms of infrastructure. A lot of numbers have been thrown left and right, 90 billions every year, 100 billions, 120 billions. Okay. Anyway, I will not stay on the numbers, but I will say two things regarding this. The first one is 80% of the financing of Africa's infrastructure is done through public funds by governments. So governments know quite well at national level how to go about financing infrastructure using several means. We don't have time to go into the details. But we were shifting from a knowledge and a capacity regarding implementation of infrastructure project at national level to another level, which was the regional level. And at that regional level, we face several issues. How could we best manage a multinational by the participation of several countries, how we could manage regional projects which implied coordination and interaction between several governments. And evidently, this thinking led us to the optimization of the concept of corridor, because the more we think about corridors in order to rationalize regional projects, the better we can communicate with the governments who are working within a corridor. Like, for example, Lagos, Abidjan, they can better understand the impacts, the necessity of fiber optic and roads in a corridor, because it has an impact on the whole economy of a region, than just having an addition of national projects, which would be a sub-optimization of a corridor. So, tackling the financing gap could not be, first of all, the responsibility only of national governments. It had to be a wider responsibility, and we, as the African Union and as the African Development Bank, as DBSA, as UNECA, and as partners, we had to start reflecting on, evidently, how to attract the private sector into these projects. So let me tell you an anecdote. But before the anecdote, let me tell you that our thinking about attracting private sector needed to be concretized through an instrument. So we worked on the arguments that could allow us to create that instrument. And we came with the idea of a continental business network, which is a gathering of institutional investors, private sector investors from all over the continent, who could help us think better the issue of tackling the financing gap by responding to the desires, the needs, the objective, the constraints of the private sector, by culturally understanding the role of the private sector. So this is how CBN is a cultural product. It's a cultural product which reflects the lack of communication which existed and the necessity to resolve that lack of communication between public entities and private entities. It has to be seen like that. So CBN could be a mechanism which could allow us to attract the private sector, but by understanding what was their thinking about their role in the implementation of PIDA projects. So at one of the breakfasts we organized with the CBN at NASDAQ in New York 5 years ago, I prepared a very, coherent and nice presentation on our PIDA projects in order to attract sovereign wealth funds and pension funds from the US and from all over the world. And I had a question which was asked to me, and that question did disturb me quite a lot. A manager of a pension fund from the US asked the following question. Tell me, we understand perfectly but Africa is the new territory towards which we should go. We think the levels of return on investment are quite good. Many countries have, made a lot of progresses in the doing business index of the World Bank. As a matter of fact, 19 African countries are doing better than China in the index of doing business of the World Bank. But so he told me, let me ask you a question. I don't see your sovereign wealth funds and your African pension funds investing in infrastructure, in African infrastructure. What I see is that they go and invest in Australia's infrastructure, in UK railways, in US highways. So this was very disturbing because he was highlighting a reality. And that reality was that we were looking for external investors, institutional external investors, but our own pension funds and sovereign wealth funds were investing less than 1% of their assets into Africa's infrastructure. And why? Why? Evidently, they were protecting the interests of their pensioners. But at the same time, they were reflecting the two causes which I mentioned before. The first one, which was weekly prepared projects, and secondly, our lack of communication towards them in order to attract them rationally to invest in these projects. And that's why we entered into a study with UNECA and the African Development Bank on the issue of de-risking. And we understood that we not only needed well-prepared projects, but we also needed to de-risk these projects, to think about guarantee mechanisms so that our own pension funds and sovereign wealth funds could be at ease in investing in Africa's infrastructure. And that's why we defined another instrument. I talked about CBN, SDN, CBN, and we defined what we call the 5% agenda, which main objective was to push, elevate, increase the level of investment of these sovereign wealth funds and pension funds in Africa's infrastructure. So we have gone a long way. We have gone a long way. Not any one of these steps could have been implemented. No progress could have been made if at the beginning we didn't have that thinking of creating a framework with priority regional projects in a bottom-up process, which we called PIDA. And now what we are facing and that we'll face together with CBN is that issue of financing. I will talk for 4 minutes more. I see you have projected your image, so I understand your message. So when we talk about financing today, we need to be very frank. We cannot continue making the speeches as usual, about we need innovative solutions. We need political will. We need to do better our homework. No, we are at a critical juncture. PIDA is now facing a reality which it has not faced before. And when I say PIDA, I'm talking about all of us and the partners regarding the implementation of PIDA, well, all of us who are directly connected to the processes that have to do with the implementation of PIDA, we need to talk about solutions. We need to talk about best practices that have happened. These are the two issues we need to focus on. We cannot repeat, best wishes and be in a certain form of illusion, think that, or focus on obstacles. No, we need to change our narrative. But by changing our narrative, we need to be very pragmatic. And pragmatism in this context means what are the solutions that we will make happen within the context of the implementation, and how can CBN can foster these solutions. And if CBN thinks that on our side, there are certain things that we have not done right, they should be put on the table. This is not a gala dinner where we have to be nice with each other. This is a reality check dinner or breakfast. And secondly, we need to see what are the best practices that have worked. And if each one of us has done its job, because we need to be accountable at the end. We cannot continue making speeches about PIDA's implementation and nobody is accountable. It's like a cloud somewhere. We need to be accountable, each one of us. What are the things that we have done right? And what are the things that we have not done right? So this is my conclusion. It is an optimistic conclusion because when we start to talk about accountability, it means we have the capacity, the will to change for the better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Asane Mayaki. You know, I've had like probably 5 or 6 pages of notes based off of what you've been sharing with us there. And there's a lot for us to discuss in our panel discussion. And I'm really looking forward to that because we have to also get to the cogs in the wheel and how we can change some of these scenarios we're facing. Because here is some of the detail around the reality that this COVID moment has wrought on our existence here on the African continent. An infrastructure financing deficit of 150 billion rand a year. I think you referenced that, a financing gap of up to 108 billion rand a year. What a different picture compared to 2008, when total commitments for African infrastructure amounted to over $100 billion. And that was an increase of 24% on the previous year. And it was the first time that it surpassed the $100 billion level. So our progress is looking like an ECG reading. Anyway, temperature taken, pulse taken aside, let's introduce to our audience our next speaker, whom you also welcomed at the very beginning, Her Excellency Ambassador Mrs. Brigitte Marcussen, who's head of the EU delegation to the African Union for the EU. Thank you very much, ma'am, and good morning and welcome to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this warm welcome. I'm very happy to be part of not of a gala dinner, but a reality check, or maybe a gala breakfast, but a reality check. Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Dr. Ibrahim Asane Mayaki, CEO of AUDA and NEPAD. I thought it was a very, very inspiring introduction, and I really noted also your 3 catchy words, that what we're doing is a matter of, it's a prioritization, it's alignment, and it's about economic transformation. I think, thank you very much for that. I also want to recognize Mr. Hubert Danzo, the chairperson of the CBN Council. But then, of course, a very warm welcome and good morning to all of you, wherever you are in the world and on the continent. It's a big, big honor for me and a pleasure to deliver these remarks on behalf of the European Union in the scope of this exactly Continental Business Network Media Breakfast. And it is, as always, a very great honor once again Your Excellency Mayaki, to benefit from your inspiring introduction and words today. I also want to focus on these times are definitely and deeply marked by the COVID-19 crisis. It has changed our way of living, it's changed our way of working, and it's created unprecedented challenges and impacts, but of course also opportunities as we talk about investments and business climate today. The European Union, acting as a team Europe with our member states, we acted in a very targeted way to address the challenges created together with our member states, as I said, and we adapted priorities and programs with our partners to address this crisis. We firmly believe that in Africa, infrastructure is a key part of the needed response and recovery, and in the broader perspectives of the building back better. And again, the issues of priority alignment and creating economic transformation, I think, is key. And infrastructure development across the various sectors, digital, energy, transport, water, has played and has to play a fundamental role, and the PIDA is considered as a key engine in the context along the efforts towards continental integration driven by the African Continental Free Trade Area, the AFCFTA. The European Union has a long-standing record of accomplishments supporting infrastructure in Africa, contributing to the implementation of the PIDA and infrastructure development at various levels, continental, regional, and national, and through multiple instruments and methods. Last but not least, with all you who are here today, our partners in Africa. I would now allow me to focus on 4 main initiatives we want to be kept accountable to as the European Union in our work together with you today as partners. The first one is about the European External Investment Plan. Because in the spirit, and I'm going to outline 4 different instruments and initiatives. The first one, the European External Investment Plan. Because in the spirit exactly of attracting sustainable investments to Africa that led to the development or that lead to the development of sustainable infrastructure, of human capital and the creation of decent jobs, the European Union rolled out our flagship initiative, the European External Investment Plan. The investment plan aims in particular at unlocking and de-risking investments. The European Fund for Sustainable Development is the financing arm of the External Investment Plan. Through the fund, the European Union offers financial guarantees and blending projects, which combine European Union grants with financing from other public and private investors. In Africa, from 2016 to 2019, 62 blending projects were approved for a total of European Union contribution of 1.8 billion euro, mainly in the energy and transport sectors. The total cost of these projects, including grants and loans, amount to 13.5 billion euro. I think it's important to say that a blending project includes grants from the European Union with loans or cash for a stake in the project, the equity, from either public financials such as governments or development banks, or private sector such as commercial banks or pension funds. Our grants help get a project off the ground. The European Union External Investment Plan works also in 2 other ways to scale up investment in our partner countries and deliver outstanding and lasting change through expertise, technical assistance, and investment climate support. The External Investment Plan is also a key tool in our support to the promotion and development of the private sector in Africa, which is key for the AFCFTA and for the PIDA implementation. I think we already saw in the PIDA second priority action plan process highlighted the huge infrastructure investment needs in Africa, which cannot be conveyed or covered by public money, as was also emphasized before. The mobilization of the private sector and of innovative financing instruments are therefore of utmost importance. Beyond investment, soft connectivity matters are equally important, and that is why our cooperation also includes a strong focus on governance reforms, regulatory frameworks, capacity building, sector enabling environment, and quality infrastructure, among others. And that is also why we're providing strong support to the African agendas on continental infrastructure towards the development of single markets, which we know a lot about as the European Union, on digital, on electricity and air transport, of course, with the objective of removing regulatory obstacles to the free movement of goods and services. The second instrument that I want to bring to your attention is the African-Europe Alliance Task Forces. You may know about the work of the African-Europe Alliance Task Forces, which were put in place with strong focus on the infrastructure sectors. This includes issues of digital economy. It includes also the sustainable energy investments and transport, and it has some clusters that are looking at connectivity, road safety, and aviation. The aim is really to bring together leading experts from the public and private sectors of both continents to provide concrete recommendations in those key areas, guiding our cooperation further. The third instrument, we as European Union, an initiative is the Africa-Europe Foundation. I'd like to mention it as the launch, as it was launched end of last year, with leading personalities from across Africa and Europe. This Africa-Europe Foundation is a platform that would facilitate strategic dialogue, catalyze partnerships, and unlock new opportunities that can transform the Africa-Europe relations into actions. The last and fourth initiative and instrument that we have as the European Union, together with you, our partners, is the EU-Africa Business Forum. The African and European private sector will meet in 2021 in the scope of the EU-Africa Business Forum, which usually takes place back-to-back with our EU-AU summit in order to explore exactly how best to unlock businesses and investment opportunities for the benefit of both our continents. We trust the efforts developed in the scope of this continental business network could be highly beneficial in that scope also. Now, I will be very pleased to listen to the distinguished panelists and hear their voice on the challenges and the opportunities, the reality check and not the gala breakfast, I understand, including through the Continental Business Network. So let me just end by really a warm thank you to the AU NEPAT, and in particular, of course, to you, Your Excellency, Dr. Ibrahim Asani Mayaki, for inviting us to take the floor in this event, the panelists whom I'm honored to meet here, and all the participants who are sitting there with us. We're not together, we're on this virtual setting, but I really look forward to listening to the deliberation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for those words. And you've also given me enough to consider during our panel discussion. I think the great thing about meeting in an online or virtual platform like this, notwithstanding, the distance and the disconnect, is that we can see each other up close and personal. And maybe there's a new type of intimacy that's created in this moment. So thank you very much for your comments. They really do appreciate it. And we'll talk more about how we can really sort of oxygenate some of the mechanisms that you're talking about that will translate into real infrastructure development and progress, and of course, cooperation on the continent and elsewhere. So really do appreciate you this morning. Just for our audience participating, thank you so much once more for being with us. And if you do require a translation of these proceedings, you're more than welcome to click on the globe icon, I'm told, and you can switch to a translation of your choice. So please do use that mechanism if you need to. Let's continue with the program now and welcome to the floor Mr. Hubert Danso, who is the chairperson of the CBN Council and also a CEO Africa investor. It's a warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much, Program Director, and welcome everybody to this important and ceremonial gathering that we have, made a real staple for, illustrating Dr. Mayaki's hard work and vision to really bring this new class of investor right to the center of the development practice as it relates to mobilizing long-term equity, as distinct from development finance, long-term equity to support PIDA projects, domestic as well as regional infrastructure related initiatives. I would personally like to thank Dr. Mayaki for his leadership, because it takes a bold vision to really enfranchise a community of sovereign institutional investors, both pension funds as well as sovereign wealth funds, who, as has sort of really been said already, a table has been set. Historically, that table has included governments, development partners, development finance institutions, multilateral organizations, and over the last decade or so, the private sector. But outside of that key and important group has really been the institutional investment community. So I think the role of the CBN and the vision that Dr. Mayaki was able to acutely identify and bring us together as a community that can do a couple of major things. I think we are much more than our capital. We have a great deal of expertise within the institutional investment community that is committed. We live on the continent where Africans, we want to use and get access to the best quality and most functioning infrastructure that's well maintained, properly financed, and gives our African private sector an opportunity to participate in the development of those particular assets. So at the CBN, we've been, just like most institutions, been working very hard in close collaboration with the excellent team at AUDA through the CBN Secretariat to really bring together some key stakeholders to define very specific areas of action that we believe, in addition to our ongoing commitment through the 5% agenda, which we will discuss, which Dr. Mayaki has mentioned, and we'll discuss in a bit more detail during the panel discussion. We've really been trying to look at what are the opportunities for us now to integrate ourselves more fully into the development family, as it were, governments, development partners, development finance institutions, so that we can, proceed and process all of the necessary governance requirements to be able to make allocations. And that's specific allocations to specific projects that are bankable and that are investable by a measure. And we hosted probably about 6 high-level closed-door meetings with the leading and the largest chairmen and CEOs that are part of the CBN from Africa's institutional investment community, the pension and the sovereign funds. And there was a unanimous commitment and rededication to support PIDA initiatives, to work very closely with the Presidential Infrastructure Champions Initiative, and to continue to feed into the African Infrastructure Guarantee Mechanism, as well as the co-guarantee platform that was originated and pioneered by AUDA and then taken forward in collaboration with the African Development Bank. But there are some issues when we come to be part of, continue to enable the institutional investment community to better understand African regional infrastructure as an investable asset class. And that's a lot of the work that we've seen through a number of the important reports that have been put out there. But there are a couple of issues that we feel the good ambassador alluded to, Dr. Mayaki alluded to, that there's going to be a feast, and there are going to be some dishes that we're familiar with and some dishes that we are not. And one of the key issues for us as the institutional investment community is access to information. And one of the key outcomes from some of our roundtables was really to look at the issue of access to data that can sufficiently inform an investment decision. And a point that came up on a regular basis was the Hamburg principles and the development finance communities and the multilateral development banks commitments and willingness to mobilize and work with the African as well as global institutional investment community. But one of the things that came out of our investigations was that the level of data that's available to development partners tends to be very different to the actual data that's available to African institutional investors. And the example that was raised by a number of different parties in terms of our innovative approach that we can take, if you look at the Room to Run program from the African Development Bank, which mobilized $1.2 billion for a securitization for assets on the African Development Bank's balance sheet. One of the main reasons that that particular opportunity was able to reach financial close, if you like, was because it had access to data from what is known as the GEMS database. And this particular database, as many of you are sort of infrastructure experts will appreciate and know, that particular data essentially exists and resides solely for the preserve of development partners or development finance institutions or multilateral development banks. So we think that there's a really good opportunity for us to be able to accelerate our ability to allocate assets to fund both regional and invest in both regional as well as domestic infrastructure through the guise of the CBN, supported, of course, with the Secretariat. So we think the CBN's got a critical and catalytic role to play in terms of bringing this data together. We also identified that the pipeline of transactions is much more aligned than we give it credit for, but we, through the CBN, have now been able to look at some very specific approaches and innovative tools and instruments, as Dr. Mayaki mentioned, that came through in the de-risking infrastructure report. So we can actually de-risk a number of transactions. And as we look at the pipeline of transactions, another overriding theme for us as the institutional investment community and CBN is how can we support our own private sectors, make the necessary adjustments to be supportive and effective and contribute towards the implementation of the $3.2 trillion African continental free trade area. And we identified a couple of very key and specific areas that we believe that we can do that just from an innovative financing approach. One is through asset ECA-backed loans, where we believe that that type of opportunity and that type of instrument is essentially almost a fixed income product. And we believe that we can apply billions of dollars to that type of opportunity because when you assess the risk, it has been de-risked on the one hand, one, because it's almost like a fixed income instrument, two, because it's backed by government and lower risk than a bond. So we're looking at various different ways to be able to apply and include large allocations to investable domestic as well as regional infrastructure projects. And I think the ambassador touched on this, which is also the importance of being able to focus on broadening the definition of infrastructure to really, as a mainstream, include digital infrastructure to really assist the African private sector, SMEs, entrepreneurs, corporates, women and youth businesses be able to participate and thrive in this new digital and global economy. So I know that we're going to be touching on a number of these particular issues under our main discussion, and I'm mindful of the time. But I think this just serves to say that we've had a very challenging but also dynamic 2020 in terms of bringing ourselves to a position where we feel, as the CBN, under the leadership of PIDA, that there's a very constructive relationship that has paved a very concrete way for us to work in very close partnership, which is the spirit of the 5% agenda, and it's the spirit of the Continental Business Network, to work in close partnership with, you know, as they say, seek ye first the political kingdom. So we now are working very closely with the ministers of finance as part of our work program for 2021, because they are instrumental in creating that enabling and hospitable policy environment for institutional investors to, one, be able to allocate to regional and domestic infrastructure as an investable asset class, and two, they also, we know, are in many respects the kind which we want to be able to allocate to at an accelerated pace and with unprecedented volumes. So I'm very pleased to see so many of our friends and partners that are on this particular meeting today, and we certainly do believe that there are good prospects. My last point is that this is a media briefing, and I would just like to, you know, make a note and mention to our colleagues in the media, you know, we do not have the trillions of dollars on the continent, as has been said, to deliver big stimulus packages. But that being said, we on the continent have you know, we've resigned ourselves to the reality that we will have to pursue a post-COVID stimulus that is private sector and infrastructure led. And as in the private sector and in the markets, one of the biggest stimuluses that you can have is confidence. So being able to work with you in the media to be able to share the insights and report in a very balanced way and a responsible way to really communicate what we're doing from an African perspective, I think is incredibly valuable, and we really do appreciate your support. So with those few words, Program Director, I'll turn the floor back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Hubert. Really do appreciate it. And I hope that during the Q&A time, we really get to drill down a little bit more into some of the headlines that you made there. Thank you very much for quoting the Bible, taking us to church. Hopefully, by the time we leave this breakfast gathering, the gospel of the opportunities for investing in the African continent, even in this moment, should be spread as far and wide as possible. And I think it kind of reaches back into what Dr. Miyake was saying, raising the question around African pension funds and their penchant for investing in other territories outside of the African continent. We know, like with shares on the stock market, these things are sentiment driven. So if we can get that belief and that reorchestration of the need to invest in the African continent, this is how we can do it credibly, invoking those instruments that Dr. Miyake talked about, the service delivery mechanisms, then maybe we can turn things around from a sentiment perspective, and we start to get real money, especially from the private sector, back into the African economy. So thank you very much for those statements. I'm going to welcome Ibra Wahabu, who is the lead private sector development and infrastructure project preparation person for PIDA NEPAD, to share this presentation with you. And then we will get into some Q&A, and we'll take some of the questions from my colleagues in the media.
Thank you so much, Iman. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon for some who are on the other part of the continent or of the world. My presentation will be very, very short, and it will consist of 4 slides. And my objective here is to demonstrate that the CBN is beyond, indeed, as our Chief Executive Officer mentioned it in the beginning, beyond that platform of talk, but also we act in terms of bringing project toward the investors. So I'm not going to focus on the vision, the mission, and the objective of the CBN, as it has been extensively discussed during the introduction by Iman and also by the CEO. But I would like to highlight 3 of the milestones of this the network. One is on the policy and the regulatory, and as well as advocacy. As you recall, during the presentation by the CEO, he emphasized on the journey of the network and the initiative that the network gave birth to, namely the 5% Agenda campaign and the Africa Infrastructure Guarantee Mechanism. And in his remarks, also the chairperson of the CBN Council has emphasizes on the importance of mobilizing institutional investor and institutional investment into infrastructure as an investment class. But also the Africa Infrastructure Guarantee Mechanism, which is a collaborative process and collaborative platform with 5 other institutions across the continent, and you can see on the screen, namely Islamic Development Bank, the Africa Trade Insurance, AFDB, Guaranco, and Afrexim Bank, plus ourselves, where we are working to upscale investment risk mitigation for key infrastructure projects on the continent, and AUD and NEPAD through the CBN is playing the role of the infrastructure window. And secondly, I would like to highlight one of the projects that the CBN has packaged 2 years ago, which is the Congo Bridge, which is a very transformative project in Central Africa. And through the exercise, through the support of the CBN, we are happy to announce that the project now has galvanized financing commitment from DFIs and other providers of capital. Now, my last slide will consist of highlighting the current pipeline of project of the CBN. As you can see on the project name list, for confidentiality purpose, we only mention the project, the region and the sector of the project. Over the years, we have been working on 9 key regional projects across Africa. As you can see, the pipeline span from East Africa, West Africa, Southern Africa, and Central Africa. And you can see on the screen some of the key variables we tackle in our analysis of the pipeline, be it the financial aspect in terms of the bankability aspect of the project, but also attractiveness of the project for public-private partnership and institutional investment. The objective of this slide is really to highlight that the network, yet is it a platform of communication and conversation, but those communication and conversation are based on real project. And as the CEO mentioned, that PIDA ultimately is about transforming lives and transformation of African economics. And this is a sample of those transformative projects we have been working on. During the conversation or the Q&A session with the media and the other stakeholders, we can take the opportunity to react in if there is any further clarification on that. Thank you so much. This is the end of the presentation.
Thank you very much to Ibra, who is also going to join us in our panel discussion. I think you brought us very nicely back into time, Ibra, so thank you very much for that. We're going to launch into our panel discussion. It should be quite a brisk one. We've got a lot of ground to cover, and I will welcome our media colleagues towards the end of that to join in and to raise any questions that they have, but you're more than welcome to use the chat function as well. You can type in your question there, and the team, I'll be monitoring it, but the team will also let me know what issues are on the table. So let's get into it then. Ibra, as I say, stays with us, and I would love to welcome to the panel Mr. Mr. Mohan Vivekanandan, who is the Group Executive for Origination and Coverage at the Development Bank of South Africa. We have Mr. Robert Lisinge, who is the Chief Energy with the Energy Infrastructure and Services section for UNECA. Bonga Masoka is the founder and chief executive at Splash Coatings Africa. You've just heard from Hubert, and he'll be back on our panel as well to kick off the discussion. And if there are any comments that need to be made by our earlier speakers, they're more than welcome as well to come in and to do so. I just want to make sure that Mohan is, oh, there you are. It's nice to talk to you again, by the way. We have some familiarity, of course, with our colleagues here in South Africa, so it's really great to be in conversation with you again. And maybe to kick it off with you, as a representative of one of the major development finance institutions here in South Africa, what kind of support can the DBSA offer to other private sector stakeholders to increase their engagement or financing infrastructure projects in Africa?
Sure. Thank you very much, Iman, and thank you very much as well to the AUDA for inviting the DBSA to be able to contribute to this discussion on the role of the private sector in Africa's infrastructure development. As it's been noted already, there's a significant gap in terms of the funding that's required, but also the skill sets as well. And so the private sector does have a significant role to play. If you think about it already, the typical type of infrastructure financing mechanism is one where the governments are borrowing out of their own balance sheet and then using those funding for projects in energy, transport, water, and other such sectors. However, what we're seeing, and I think this was a comment that was made by a couple of the speakers earlier, is that there is this fiscal constraint. It was already starting to develop, and it's gotten worse during the last year with the COVID crisis, where governments simply don't have the fiscal positions anymore. So they need to open up more and more of their sectors for investment by the private sector. Now, we as the DBSA, it's something that we've been focusing in on, where we've specifically been looking at not just the value of our own lending into projects, but the value of projects we're able to help unlock through a number of different mechanisms. One of them is support in the early stages. This is a concept I know that Dr. Mayaki was speaking about around project preparation, and the fact that the DBSA also has a division focused around preparing projects, providing funding in the early stages. Typically it's up to 3 to 5% of the capital cost of a project to get those projects up and running. And there we work with both public sector entities, supporting them with project preparation needs, but also with private sector. So it's one where private developers can also approach us and we jointly work with them. And there've been projects, for instance, a gas-fired power generation projects in Ghana and Nigeria that we've been involved in. Other energy projects in Madagascar, and a number of such projects in South Africa as well. So that's one. And then, on the lending side, what we see is our role is to provide a portion of the funding that's needed. And where we come in is as a development bank, we tend to provide longer tenor, which complements the role of commercial banks. So in the same transaction, you may have a commercial bank that's providing 5-7 year loans, whereas we as a development bank may be providing a 15-year loan. And an example of that would be, for instance, the Tanzania Standard Gauge Railway project that we're involved in with a number of other development partners, but also commercial partners as well. And then coming closer to South Africa now, we've been appointed to set up the infrastructure fund on behalf of the government of South Africa. There's a number of projects coming through, and really the concept behind that is we will provide a portion of the funding as the DBSA, unlock capital also from the South African fiscus, but a significant portion of the financing will then come from private investors, either providing funding as equity into projects, or commercial banks and institutional investors providing private debt into these projects as well, and hence opening up a lot of opportunities. But the key element in all of this, we believe, though, is having the projects, having the list of bankable projects there that we can invest in. And a big element there is around this program approach, where in each of the different infrastructure sectors, we help unlock a program of investable projects similar to the IPP program, the Independent Power Producer Program for renewable energy in South Africa, which has unlocked 100+ projects in the energy sector for renewables. So maybe let me stop there and come through later. Thank you very
maybe
much.
just a really quick follow-up to you, just with regard to the last statement you made, and Dr. Mayaki was talking about it really at the very beginning, was around the weak preparation of the projects, which of course diminish your ability to make a compelling argument for funding and then subsequently not getting it, and spoke about that being an opportunity for us to do some self-correction. What advice, or what can you share with us around how we can get around that weakness?
Look, I mean, it is an issue. And if you think about it, the project sponsor who's looking to develop that project has to make that early stage investment. As I said, let's say roughly 5% of the capital cost of a project. Now, the challenge is, if you're thinking about it from a private sector role, you're only going to make that kind of an investment, in doing the detailed environmental studies, the engineering work, the legal studies, the market studies, and other such elements. You're only going to make those kinds of investments if you think there's a very decent chance that that project will actually be awarded to you and you'll be able to carry it forward. So that enabling environment is an important element. For instance, the various, and there's a lot of different elements that make up that enabling environment, and that's traditionally a government role to be played. The other is to have certainty behind that award. So you need to be able to award that contract to an entity for them to then make those investments. So it's a little bit of a chicken and egg situation where, as a government, you may not want to make that award till enough work has been done to see if it's feasible.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, as a private entity, you're not going to make those investments till you know with some certainty that you're going to be the entity that's going to carry that work through. Otherwise, why make that significant upfront investment?
Absolutely. I think I'm going to toss the ball then to Robert Lesinge to pick up on this aspect. I know you've been briefed to talk about how we can really accelerate the creation of an enabling environment. And maybe in doing so, you can also address some of the main bottlenecks in African countries to mobilize financing in infrastructure, and especially, of course, in terms of policy and within the regulatory environment.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me. It's really a pleasure to be part of this forum. And I also want to thank Dr. Mayaki, especially for saying that we should not be tapping ourselves on the back, but be critical and also to come up with solutions. I think in terms of the enabling environment for private sector investment in Africa's infrastructure, one could look at three dimensions. The first would be how open is this environment for private sector investment. And when I say open, I'm talking about the existence of a strategy for infrastructure development, the existence of a business plan, an investment plan, and clear targets for infrastructure development on the continent. This is what would give the business environment the confidence that a country is ready, has the political will, is determined, has ownership of its infrastructure projects. Second, one would have to look at how attractive is the environment for private sector investment in infrastructure. So I take energy, for instance. Do you have incentives for the private sector to invest, say, in renewable energy? Is it even acceptable in the first place that the private sector could invest in generation, transmission, or distribution of energy? What about the tariff system in the country? Is this something that is attractive to the private sector? We shouldn't forget that the private sector is all about business and benefits. Nobody is going to go away. The tariff will not even enable you to make back your investment. And then third is how ready is the environment for private sector investment. So you want independent power producers to generate electricity, for example. Do you have the transmission and distribution lines that the electricity that is generated would be transmitted and distributed. So these are some of the typical aspects of the regulatory environment for private sector investment. But beyond that, there are multiple challenges for investment in infrastructure in Africa. And Dr. Mayaki mentioned some of those. The first is the capacity for African countries to engage with the private sector. And when I say capacity, I talk about capacity for developing a bankable project. One of the things we do at ECA is to facilitate engagement between African countries on the one hand and investors on the other. And we find out a lot of times that the information that the private sector needs to commit or to engage in a project is simply not there. Information like how viable is the off-taker of an energy product? What about, for instance, land property rights that the private sector will want to make sure that is available? So most of the time, you find out that the discussion between the private sector and the government is strained because some of this information is not forthcoming. And I should say that there are a number of factors leading to this. It depends on who initiates these deals. And most of the time, if the private sector initiates a deal, the projects that are on the table are not necessarily the priority of the government. And so you see that the information that is required by the private sector is not necessarily there. But in a case where the government or regional organization initiate these discussions, I don't think that should be the problem. For instance, we have PIDA. We have now identified the priority projects for PIDA Part 2, second phase of PIDA. And I think that this should be the basis for discussion between the private sector and the government. And I think that this is where the continental business network could come into play. Dr. Mayaki has asked for concrete solutions of what could be done. I think beyond being a high-level advisory platform, which is a good thing, I think that the continental business network should also play a concrete role in terms of organizing roundtables between the private sector, but also African governments on the projects that have been identified as PIDA priority projects. This could be done at the regional level because the PIDA priority projects were selected essentially by the regional economic communities. So I'm thinking, for instance, why can't the Continental Business Network work with other stakeholders to organize regional investment forums where we'll discuss essentially and exclusively PIDA projects. Why am I saying this? One of the criteria for selecting PIDA projects is the extent to which they are financially viable. So by definition, I think there are about 70 projects for PIDA PAP 2. It means that these projects have been screened and we have determined that they are financially viable. So we have to hit the road, region by region, to organize investment forums for these PIDA projects. Now, there are other issues. I don't think I have too much time, but we have security, political issues. They have institutional issues that are also constraints to infrastructure development. If I have more time, I may touch on other challenges that we find.
Yeah, sadly, Robert, time is not our friend this morning, but I think that you've touched on such important aspects where we could, you've made us understand the doors so much better so that we understand which keys to use where. And I think that is an important recognition that we need to make in terms of where to apply our attention, our energy, and our focus. Speaking of which, and it's something you touched on now, was the availability of information. And I want to welcome our next speaker for the panel, Bonga Masoka, who's going to talk about the role of SMMEs in large-scale infrastructure development in Africa. And Bonga, perhaps, welcome, by the way, perhaps one of the things you might say is that there is almost a non-democratic access to the kind of valuable information that a young entrepreneur needs about where to go, where will the grants and loans come from, and where is my pipeline of integration into this successful kind of role that I can play in infrastructure development projects. Is Bonga there? Bonga, you have to show us your face and you have to unmute yourself. So welcome, good morning.
Oh, sorry about that. Thank you very much, Ivan.
You're talking to the walls.
And I'm the young person, I'm supposed to be clued up on this. I'm sorry about that.
Go ahead.
But thank you very much for the invitation and consideration, and to the viewers for participating in this forum. I think the question should rather be what could be the role of MSMEs in large-scale infrastructure development. And the reason I'm saying this is because of there is limited access, or there is limited information currently in terms of, one, the involvement of MSMEs. We don't have data in terms of where, what, how many MSMEs are involved in large infrastructure projects in Africa. So that's why I feel that we should rather focus on what could be instead of what is the role, because the role as it currently exists, the role as it currently stands does not primarily exist. You know, the MSMEs community is comprised of primarily micro and informal, is comprised primarily of micro and informal enterprises. And those are statistics in the continent in general. Generally argue that we have not been able to fully exploit the potential. Hello, Iman?
I'm here, right here, listening to you intently. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that. So what we basically seeing in Africa is that one could generally argue that we have not been able to fully exploit the potential of Africa's MSMEs sector. And this is proven to contain, I mean, this is a sector that has, or that is proven to contain significant amount of capital and human resource capital, you know. So access to information is one of, I mean, in South Africa, for instance, we still have a large pool of SMME sector that is struggling to have access or to access information on funding. If South Africa, for instance, still has those struggles, then you can only imagine countries in the continent that are still leapfrogging or still catching up to the standard of South Africa, for instance, you know.
Right. And thank you so much for that. And speaking frankly, I wish that we'd had more time, because I'm very interested in this democratizing of information, because it really is the first start. You have these, you know, and personally, just as a confession to all of our panelists, I mean, aside from 2 years ago when I was invited to do one of the conferences, I hadn't really had a keen understanding of the work that PIDA, you know, is doing, or, you know, networks like CBN. And it was such a boon to be able to know that they exist and how their work is actually conducted. So Ibra, I want to bring you back onto the microphone. Let's talk about, as an instrument, what is the value add of CBN compared to, you know, some of the other tools under PIDA, and why should we really sit more frequently around this fire?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Iman, and thank you to other panelists for the valuable contribution. So I think the value proposition of CBN can be articulated maybe in two aspects, and they are inherent to the nature of the network. One aspect is that the CBN is not a standalone instrument, and it's a result of a process, and that process starts with the prioritization and the alignment that has been mentioned in the opening of this conversation. So the CBN is a result of that process, but it's not standing alone. It's embedded to other instruments like the service delivery mechanism for the early stage project preparation that Mohan just mentioned, how critical it is. It's embedded to the NEPA infrastructure project preparation facility, which is a bigger project preparation facility. It's embedded to the risk mitigation aspect, like the 5% agenda campaign or the Africa Infrastructure Guarantee Mechanism. So this is unique in the sense that if it's the CBN promote a project, it means that that project has been gone through due consideration for the early stage, the enabling environment, the risk mitigation, and most importantly, the political commitment. Because Robert just mentioned that most of the time, if the project is initiated by government, has more likelihood to see the light. So the CBN has that process in terms of political commitment, also enabling environment. So this is one value addition that the CBN has that other standalone private sector platforms do not have. Secondly, is on the nature of the network itself. The CBN is accountable to head of state. It's an initiative that is directly mandated by the African Union and to bring private sector's concern into the infrastructure development conversation on the continent. So because of its required accountability to the head of state, evidently, the CBN has the obligation of result to the people compared to a privately initiated platform. So in addition of these two aspects, I think to respond to maybe some of the concern Bonga mentioned in terms of access to information to small scale entrepreneurship or to SMEs, is to say that primarily the mandate or the operation of the CBN or the overall AUD and NEPAD infrastructure intervention is driven by the ideas of NEPAD and the Agenda 2063. And as we know, those ideas are profoundly and fundamentally about people and local content, et cetera, et cetera. And maybe to address the aspect of the availability of information is to say that one of the key instruments that we are working on to bring the SMEs in the large scale infrastructure conversation is the PIDA job creation toolkit. And there will be a dedicated session during this PIDA week on that. The PIDA job creation toolkit allow the community and the SMEs to play an important role in the PIDA infrastructure project implementation. And because for each project that we can consider, we will be able to see precisely which are the key sector of the industry that requires specific targeted information, intervention to galvanize the involvement of SMEs, create job and maximize the local content. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And just to reiterate, as you've just pointed out, there is a vast resource on the PIDA website. Also just, conferences past, papers past that you can go and interact with. I want to open the floor up for questions and also for other input if some of the panelists feel that they want to add something that is really going to add something really impactful that our, especially SMMEs need to know, SMMEs need to know, or some of the other stakeholders need to know. What you can do is raise your hand and you can have the microphone. Don't be shy. I know that in these days of virtual interactions, most of us don't like to show our faces because we're at home or we're wearing our onesies. I hope all of us dressed up for the conversation. I think we have 89 participants online. So I hope that everyone is ready to work this morning. But if you have any questions that you would like to raise directly, please do that. You can use the raise your hand function, or you can just put them into the chat. And I will share those with our panelists. I think that we can really use this time to be able to do that. Hubert, maybe I welcome you back to the microphone as well. Seeing as this is a breakfast that is hosted in your name,
sure.
How do we short circuit? The reality is, and we can see this in South Africa, a lot of our budgets are diverted to COVID management, to procuring of vaccines. We've seen a lot of coalescing, financially speaking, around managing COVID in our country. This is going to be the same for a lot of countries across the African continent. what is the unique, adaptive, and one of the words I hate the most, sort of pivotal strategies we are engaging in as African investors to try and still continue to work effectively in this climate?
Well, I think that's almost the reason for being for the CBN. And I think, as Dr. Miyake mentioned, and a number of our other colleagues and speakers have alluded to, this is much more than just advocacy. What we are really targeting and focusing on in terms of the genius of this particular partnership and the reason that CBN was established is really to create a bridge that hasn't necessarily been there to facilitate and build trust between the public sector and the private sector in a way that hasn't actually been seen before. And I know that Dr. Miyake gave reference to the fact that a lot of pension capital finds its way to Australia and Canada, and there's absolutely no reason why they shouldn't continue to be seen as one of the most attractive and interesting markets for institutional investors to allocate to infrastructure as an investable asset class. And when they started on that particular journey, they realized that when they went through different initiatives trying to crowd in institutional capital, various privatization initiatives and a number of other different sort of related programs to mobilize funding and investment into infrastructure, what became very clear to them was the percentage of private sector participation was very low in the absence of long-term institutional investors, pension and sovereign funds. I think it was less than sort of 20% take up by the private sector. But then when they created a framework under the treasurer of the time in Australia called Ambassador Hockey, he basically promoted a strong operational partnership between institutional investors and governments, on the understanding that the institutional investors are almost a quasi-government in many respects. There was much more trust. So they actually took the acronym PPP and said, okay, let's keep PPP, but we are long-term equity investors. We're not the development financiers and the debt providers. So let's call it pensions public partnerships. And as a consequence of building this new partnership, they were able to bring long-term institutional assets, their advisors, their portfolio companies, their banks, and a number of other key players in the ecosystem to work with the government to structure transactions. And I think that particular ingredient for success has manifested itself very much in the approach that we take at the CBN. So we are saying yes. Oh, sorry.
Right. Sorry, just to interject there, because I'm thinking then, let's take one of the questions that our journalists are posing. I'm going to start very quickly with Ndumiso Milo, who's from Xinhua News, saying, sorry, I joined a bit late. Could Dr. Miyake tell us where we are with PIDA challenges and way forward? And Ndumiso, I'm really sorry you joined late. I get the impression you joined really late, because a lot of those issues were underlined and addressed by Dr. Miyake. And I know that there will be a recording that is available after the session on the website. But one of the key things maybe that will be helpful to you is in terms of addressing weaknesses. Dr. Miyake did reference the service delivery mechanism. So I think that there's a lot of content just with relation to where some of those anomalies and peripheries are that have been breached through the way it's being seen now. But I do want to go to this question from Pamela Kumba, who's from Channel Africa. And Mahan, maybe this one is for you. Good day. My question is, when funding is accorded for projects in Africa, is there any lowering of interest when giving back, knowing the difficult coronavirus context affecting our African economies? And maybe anyone else who has a view on this one can also interject really quickly. We are literally out of time, so we're going to have to do a hop, skip, and a jump through this last one.
Sure. I think just quickly, I assume she's saying lowering of the interest rates. I think what will happen is, there's typically a blended version of financing. The private sector funders, are unfortunately not going to lower the interest rates because, it's really a commercial transaction. They're going to compare the pricing versus other similar risk types. However, where there is an opportunity can come in is to blend in concessional financing from a development bank like ourselves, or even some of the grants. For instance, the EU ambassador spoke about the grants from them and how that gets leveraged into much bigger projects. But that 1.8 billion euros, for instance, from them could then be used to lower the cost of capital, of the overall weighted average cost of capital of a project. And that's something that we do look to try and do, sourcing funds from the likes of the Green Climate Fund, as an example. We've set up a climate finance facility as the DBSA to fund long tenor investments in renewable energy and other climate financing in Southern Africa. So that's an example of doing that.
All right, thank you very, very much. Go ahead, Hubert. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, just to build on to the point that Mohan raised, and it's a really good question. And one of the things, since we're all an ecosystem, that we are hearing and seeing in the market, and I know that Alda was right at the forefront of trying to bring this up, is this issue of being charged for perceived risk in our infrastructure transactions and paying a premium for that to commercial banks, and in some cases to development finance institutions, relative to the actual risk associated with those same projects. So if you are doing an infrastructure project in the market and they've complied with all of the best practice standards, in some cases, there's a practice that we feel that it's going to be very important to work with our heads of state, to work with our development partners, because if you are overpricing for a product when data demonstrates that it should be priced at a lower rate, we see sort of groups of financiers coming together, lock in a price on the basis of a perceived risk, charge a premium, and because there are few alternatives for access to that finance, the continent is actually being taken advantage of. And it just relates right through to the project chain. So we actually really do believe that there's an important piece of work to do with the way that we are paying a premium for our projects in spite of a lot of data from Moody's and a number of others. We are paying for perceived risk versus actual risk. And I'm not saying that's just mainstream across the board, but it is happening. And at this critical time, we call on development partners, development finance institutions, commercial banks, and the project finance community to review that. In the spirit of stakeholder activism, let's review a country or a project that has been complying with all of the covenants around its financing, is coming back for more financing, and it's still being charged a premium as if it had defaulted. We don't have that capacity in the continent to do that. And someone actually raised the issue that it's almost a human rights issue. Why would we pay such a premium when we have the greatest need in the continent and the least access to larger pools of more competitive capital? That's something that we are very passionate that we really need to look at with our political leaders and our friends in the development partner world and the development finance institutions to do something about that, because we continue every conference for 10 years to talk about perceived versus actual risk. I think it's time that the CBN and others like DBSA, like the EU, work together to address those anomalies. Thank you.
Well, take a breath for me, because I know that you're touching on something. I know in South Africa, as a radio host, this is a big issue around that criteria, also around the role of the ratings agencies themselves and their criteria. Vivek Mittal from PIDA Africa says the last comment is totally wrong. I'm actually going to bring, I think Vivek is on the line, so I think we can bring him in. Go ahead, Vivek, and make your comment, albeit briefly.
Thank you very much. So AFIDA is an association of private sector investors and developers active in African infrastructure. And I will actually respond directly to the last comment, in that there is a process of procurement, and investors and banks respond to that. They have their own cost of funding that they have to take into account. Africa has a good track record of well-structured projects. It also has a track record of projects that fail from time to time. And we have to do more of the former and less of the later. And unfortunately, until that happens, people will add premium to the projects. Now, one of the issues that we are facing as a result of COVID, which is what I wanted to talk about, is that there's about $130 billion of private sector capital that is potentially under threat because governments are running out of the ability to service their obligations under these contracts. So the private sector, we represent about nearly 30 members right now who have between them about $30 billion of capital. But they are increasingly worried about their existing investments, which also need to be taken care of. But they are very, very keen to be relevant in the current crisis and the future growths that Africa is looking forward to. So that's, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, typical gathering floor is not switching your microphone back on. I believe our ambassador, our EU ambassador as well, is happy to say something. Her Excellency Brigitte Markussen wants to respond in terms of the EU perspective. I'm going to take that comment and then I'm going to have to wrap the session with a close from Dr. Ibrahim Mayaki. So I'll take just a response from Madam Markussen, and then we will close with the Dr. Mayaki. And what I want to encourage everyone to do is there is an opportunity to engage on the website to let us know some of the outstanding things, also to attend some of the other sessions. So you're more than welcome throughout this PIDA week to keep the engagement going. If you don't get your answer today, it's more than likely you'll get your answer tomorrow. So Mrs. Markussen, if I could invite you to quickly grab the floor, and then we will conclude these proceedings.
Thank you very much. Just very, very quick comments, because I saw the question from the media on what priorities are. And I think the first point is, of course, that we always work in partnership with those that we're collaborating with. And then I want to just pinpoint that the main instrument from our side will be the external investment plan. And I think a key issue that I'm also taking away from the various panelists is to make the link between the various, let's say, those who make the investments, but definitely also looking at what is needed, or what we call the soft connectivity matters, which is very much linked to, for instance, the governance reforms that are needed to get the economic transformation. I think that His Excellency was talking about when we just started. So, but of course, from a European Union, if you talk about global priorities, we're looking very much at green investments. It's the building back better. It's very much digital transformation. And obviously, with the crisis we have at hand, it's the health sector. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for that. I want to welcome back to the mic Dr. Ibrahim Asane Mayaki, who's the CEO of PIDA and NEPAD. And Dr. Mayaki, you again, within the limitations of time, I think we've tried to touch on as many points as we possibly could in delivering your concluding statements. And I would also like to say this by thanking everybody who's participated this morning for giving up your time to be with us and to be a part of this. We really, really do appreciate you on behalf of the organizers. Thank you very much. Dr. Mayaki, I suppose in closing, if you could answer one of these questions from one of my colleagues, and this is Gabrielle Nina, a freelance journalist from the Congo, who's asking, during COVID-19, did it impact any PIDA projects during the course of 2019 and 2020?
Thank you very much. I first of all, let me really thank you, Iman, for so smartly and dynamically organizing the conversations and focusing on the essential points. And let me thank all the panelists, and with a particular appreciation for the EU ambassador. So mine will be very quick. Regarding the question, which is not part of my synthesis, but regarding the question of the impact of COVID, I think it's too soon to really evaluate the impact that COVID will have. I think we are going to see these impacts in the next 2 to 3 years. And we need to apprehend the potential impacts. And we have sufficient data in order to apprehend the potential impacts. But the impacts will be felt in the next 2 to 3 years, the world over. But in Africa, that will lead us to necessarily increase our institutional quality. The quality of our institutions need to be enhanced. And that leads me to my first point in terms of conclusion. We have an alignment of thinking about the enabling environment. But fundamentally, when we talk about enabling environment, we are talking about governance issues. These governance issues need to be solved. We didn't say a word about corruption today, but corruption is an issue. And in infrastructure, it is an issue. So we don't have time to go into the details, but this issue will need to be flagged in terms of governance system so that we reduce, minimize, eliminate every form of potential corruption, because we know that infrastructure, the infrastructure domain is a domain also of corruption. So governance, first point. The second point is the tools that we have built, all of us, in order to facilitate PIDA's implementation. These tools are coherent and they are proving to be efficient. Thirdly, CBN is extremely relevant today, is much more relevant today during this COVID period than it was before. Because in terms of organizational behavior, we see that the governments which succeed, are those who have reinvented communication modes with their communities, with the private sector, with the civil society. Those are the governments that succeed. The governments who are continuing to do business as usual in their communication mode with the stakeholders whom they serve, these governments fail. So CBN being a platform of communication between the public and the private sector, I think is more needed than ever. And lastly, I took a concrete recommendation from Dr. Lisingi, and we'll work on it. It's the fact that CBN needs to hit the road region by region by organizing regional roundtables with the projects which are affecting the regions. So let me thank you again, Iman. Thank the chair of CBN, Hubert Danso. Thank all the panelists and thank the EU ambassador for having taken their time to be with us. The EU is a very strong partner in PIDA from the start. So these are my final words. And thank you again for the moderation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miyake. Really appreciate that. To all of our panelists and those who managed to get their questions in. Tumela, I see you, but we're out of time. I welcome you to have a leg stretch until 12 o'clock, which is when our next session continues. Please do stay with us for all of PIDA Week. It could not be more important than in this moment, in a time of potential chaos, but definitely a time of change. Good afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.